Come join us over on The Deprogram, a podcast I run with Second Thought and Yugopnik.
To quote our favorite authoritarian GT, have these gentlemen ever seen these nuts?
Intro topics, history, memes, and me being perpetually tired, all of it is at your disposal over on the links in the description and pinned comment. Hello. In the late 1980s, the Eastern Bloc was sold off to the highest bidder thanks in large part to the CIA and US government. One by one, the left-wing governments of the Warsaw Pact were brought down. However, there was a pattern. The events themselves have their nuances and some surface differences, but overall you can see the fingerprints of American intelligence agencies and American capital interests pushing buttons behind the scenes. It's difficult to convey the scope and magnitude of the CIA's role in the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, but one thing is clear. Communism didn't fall in Eastern Europe, it was overthrown by the best coups money can buy. If you search Poland Revolution 1989, you'll likely be served some version of this short, seemingly tidy answer. On the 4th of June 1989, Poland's Solidarity Trade Union won an overwhelming victory in partially free elections, leading to the peaceful fall of communism in Poland. Clean, peaceful elections made the changes they wanted and didn't have to resort to any of that messy, violent revolution stuff. It embodies the liberal fantasy of how they believe their system to work and how history takes place. Unfortunately for them, it's only that, a fantasy.
The Nazis have occupied the town, which is still burning and in complete ruin.
Following the unimaginable and unprecedented destruction brought upon Poland in World War II, a referendum, known as the 3 times Yes, was passed by the State National Council in 1946. 6 years later, in 1952, Poland adopted a communist constitution creating the People's Republic of Poland and would join the famous Warsaw Pact 3 years later in 1955. For those unaware, the Warsaw Pact was a collective defense treaty established by the Soviet Union and several allied nations in 1955 as a response to the founding of NATO 6 years earlier. Moving swiftly along, the first major episodes of political unrest in Poland begin in mid-December 1970, when workers went on strike due to an increase in cost of food and other goods. This happened due to a variety of reasons, but mostly it was mistaken economic policy focused on the reinstitution of private property and increased market mechanisms, like in Yugoslavia. The TLDR of it is, the Polish socialists felt that reintroducing market relations was a good idea, mostly because of the heavy influence of Western economic zeitgeist at the time, trends of thought that even Soviet economists were sadly affected by. This, combined with a mistaken policy of larger emphasis on heavy industry for supporting economic development over light industry, which produces consumer goods, resulted in waves of protests mostly led by rank-and-file party members themselves. The government would increase wages to compensate, however, without a tie to inflation, this was only a temporary fix. Attempting a more concrete fix, new plans were drawn for heavy investment in agriculture, consumer good production, and even the development of inexpensive Polish automobiles for regular people, with some limited success considering how hard it is to start the car industry from scratch. Take a look at the FSO Polonaise. Poland did see some improvement. More mistakes were made, however, as loans from the IMF were taken out, whose payments would exacerbate the government's inability to support certain fundamental social programs, again, like in Yugoslavia. In order to get new loans, Western banks demanded, and were subsequently granted, the ability to monitor and affect Polish economic policy, the first nail in the coffin. It's in this context we enter the end we're here to understand. Back to the video in just a second, let's hear from Blinkist. Blinkist is an app that allows you to derive and understand all the core points from over 6,600 non-fiction titles and podcasts in just 15 minutes. It's a great way of enlarging your base of knowledge, especially when on the go or in a time crunch. Grocery shopping, a train ride, or waiting for an appointment can all be turned to opportunities to absorb and understand new and exciting information, all from the comfort of your phone. With thousands of books on offer in 27 different categories, it's a great way to get bite-sized packs of information, both in text and audio format if you so choose. The diversity in thought presented is very wide, and they even have neat little recommendations for other related reading you could do to contrast with different perspectives. I know several people with busy lives that without Blinkist would have never actively read before. Of course, to test out the platform, the first thing I went to was the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which is one of the many options they have in their politics and philosophy sections. The work, as you should know, was one of the first popular presentations of communism as a political movement regarding class struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie, and I was pleasantly surprised by how well the ideas were presented, as well as how convenient it was to pick up. A great thing to read or listen to with any downtime. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer for you guys. click the link in the description to start your free 7-day trial and get 25% off premium membership. And at no additional cost to you, Blinkist has a new feature, Blinkist Spaces. This feature allows you to create a space with friends or family where you can recommend titles to each other. All members of a shared space can access all titles in the space, with or without a Blinkist Premium subscription. So what are you waiting for? Get your 7-day free trial and 25% off Blinkist Premium by using my link in the description below. Big thanks to Blinkist for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is very appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Addendum about the food shortage stuff. We hear the haha communism no food joke all the time, even though empirical evidence is overwhelming in showing that socialist countries entirely met the caloric and nutritional requirements of their people, unlike many capitalist countries, including the US, which has 44 million food insecure people right now. In Poland in the 1970s, Polish animal protein intake was equal to or exceeded that of Western Europe. The shortages overemphasized in popular media were more a result of an overemphasis on market mechanisms as well as mistaken economic policy on the Polish leadership side. It's interesting to note that Polish shortages were not paralleled in other socialist nations at the time, showing that this was a characteristic of Poland's unique conditions and not a failure of communism or whatever. Likewise, interesting to note that similar shortages happened in the USSR only when, surprise surprise, similar forced reintroduction of and overemphasis on market relations was adopted in the late 1980s. Anyways, on to the coup. The 1970s protests wouldn't be the last. World economic turmoil in the mid-70s stoked unrest in many places, including the US, but following the 1976 protest in Poland, a resistance group formed called the Workers' Defense Committee, or KOR. Initially limited to just 34 Social Democrat-type dissidents, it included World War II resistance and anti-Bolshevik war veterans, prominent elder intellectuals, and former leaders of an earlier student movement in the late 60s. Interestingly, while the most influential member, Jacek Kuron, was a part of this founding group as a former student leader, future Prime Minister and party leader Lech Walesa was not. However, that doesn't mean that Walesa wasn't engaged in politics. In fact, he was fired from his job for attempting to organize a protest in July 1976 and would soon after join the KOR in a non-leadership role. What made Walesa so attractive to the CIA and US interests was his anti-communist, pro-decentralization, and pro-market views. Walesa made important connections with other leading intellectuals in the KOR, which led to him being heavily promoted by opposition literature and eventually Western radio outfits, which relied almost solely on the KOR for its information. A prime example of this type of work can be seen in the early weeks of the 1980 strike. The news they collected would be given to CIA-run radio shows such as Radio Free Europe and Voice of America for the purpose of broadcasting Western propaganda back into Poland, of course with the intention of destabilizing the Polish government. The US thought of Poland as their most exciting and important opportunity for the West since 1945. When the Polish government found out about this operation, they obviously tried to end it and did so by arresting several KOR leaders, including Jacek Kuron. As if to leave absolutely no doubt as to where KOR's loyalties and ideology lie, Walesa gave an interview in December 1980 wherein he praised Ronald Reagan's election as a good sign to the world and Poland. Given all of this, especially the aforementioned operation to disseminate Western-funded propaganda, there is a good reason to believe that the KOR was being financed, in part by the CIA, which was actively engaged in attempts to destabilize Polish politics. The KOR wouldn't exist for long and would be superseded by another, more consequential organization called Solidarity. Walesa would end up the leader of Solidarity and almost immediately appealed for US assistance in a Washington Post interview in October of 1981, saying, quote, "Poland may not appear a profitable investment for you now, but if we can succeed with what we're doing here, it will benefit you in the long run," of course. The investment talk was the only thing that got them excited. This quote is consistent with other statements he made, such as in September of 1980 at Solidarity's first National Congress. It's also consistent with influential elements within the group advocating for a counter-revolution with slogans about quote-unquote free elections that were like in those so-called Western democracies where communist parties were regularly banned and suppressed. How incredibly free. Clearly then, Solidarity wasn't a trade union per se and was pushing for the current system to cease existing so that they can bring in a sort of liberal capitalism. Hearing the pleas loud and clear, the CIA covertly supported Solidarity, and the National Endowment for Democracy was given $1 million congressionally approved dollars with which they were to assist Solidarity. The CIA-funded group was provided with, amongst other things, shortwave radios, computers, video cameras, photocopiers, and Poland's first tax machines. Now this is not scripted, but just imagine if, I don't know, some like opposition party or group or whatnot in your country was supported by Russia or China or South Africa or Brazil or whoever else, and were given millions of dollars and all the necessary, computers and phones and photocopying material and everything they need to run their operations basically. Wouldn't this kind of affect your trust in this particular organization? Wouldn't they at least be, somewhat affected by the politics of the people giving them all this money and support? It's a stupid thing that people miss. All these items were smuggled into the country via US assets in the country, which included local Catholic priests, CIA operatives, and representatives of the right-wing US-based AFL-CIO union and others sympathetic to the anti-communist cause. In fact, Solidarity invited the staunchly anti-communist head of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, and his European counterpart, Irving Brown, to speak at a Solidarity National Convention. Kirkland and Brown had worked closely with the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA in the US, immediately after World War II to ensure that the Union movement in West Germany wasn't influenced by communists, and Brown was considered an expert agent provocateur by the CIA, putting his skills to extensive use in this case. By the late 1980s, the AFL-CIO had raised $140,000 for Solidarity, as well as circulating their free trade union news to Solidarity leadership, but not rank-and-file members, interestingly enough. Deepening the foreign support, in March 1981, after meeting with Polish authorities, Western banks stated that among the conditions for the continued rescheduling of Polish debt was Solidarity being guaranteed relative freedom of action. Not to lose the point, Solidarity was a large organization with many well-meaning people, and an argument could be made that a majority of the rank and file didn't want the overthrow of Polish socialism, just quality of life changes. Even the leadership manipulated by foreign intelligence had their own plans that were quickly co-opted by American and Western foreign policy interests towards a counter-revolutionary direction. Fearful of a Soviet invasion, one that would never materialize or even be planned, General Jaruzelski imposed martial law in Poland on the 13th of December 1981. Unfortunately for the general, the CIA had infiltrated his general staff in the person of Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski, who spent over 10 years divulging Warsaw Pact military secrets to the US, including Polish government attempts to combat Solidarity's project. Getting back to Kuklinski for a moment, you can't understate how great of an asset he was to the CIA. A senior CIA strategy expert said he passed on an estimated 35,000 pages of documents to the United States. Solidarity's leaders were arrested for their program of attempting to overthrow the government by the early 80s, but were released and allowed to regroup prior to the 1988 riots. These protests and riots broke out in 1988 due to food prices rising to levels intolerable to the Polish working class. The Polish government was under tremendous pressure not only due to rising costs of food, but also had to contend with unreasonable debt imposed by loans from the US-led International Monetary Fund, and began holding talks with Solidarity in April of 1989. Of course, a political decision that was imposed on them. By June, they reached an agreement which included holding new, semi-free elections. Since this was the era of glasnost and perestroika, these reforms didn't really alarm the USSR, which meant that they wouldn't intervene. Solidarity would sweep the elections. However, the old guard, meaning the communists, still made up a majority of the appointed deputies. These elections also saw the re-election of General Jaruzelski as president, but seeing the popularity of Solidarity in the election results, he offered seats to them in a coalition government. A few weeks later, following the resignation of old guard Prime Minister General Kiszczak, a founding member of Solidarity, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, became Prime Minister leading the coalition government. I butchered both their names probably. Mazowiecki is notable simply for being the first non-communist Prime Minister of the Polish neoliberal era. Walesa would become president in 1990, replacing the general, completing this so-called peaceful revolution. In what would become an oft-used tactic by neoliberals inheriting a struggling economy ripe for exploitation, the new government implemented a set of policies known as shock therapy in order to liberalize the economy, which really just entails loosening or removing worker protections, removal of any and all price caps or controls, massive reduction and elimination of social services, and, most damaging of all, the selling off of assets and selling the dying public services not completely cut. The results of shock therapy are predictably devastating to all but those sweeping in to take advantage of what the Polish working class had built. The first dose of shock therapy was administered on January 1st, 1990 by Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz, who was a member of Solidarity and studied economics in the US. No points for guessing that. For starters, Poland's foreign debt stood at $40 billion, approximately $97 billion today, and inflation was 2,000%. The IMF provided a comparatively poor $1.5 billion loan with a program to keep Poland on their payments. In addition, here's the remaining list of reforms: all state subsidies abolished, the lifting of all price controls, all wages frozen by means of penal taxation of wage, the setting of very high interest rates, amongst others. Abolishing all state subsidies effectively eliminated one-third of Poland's economy. Unsurprisingly, the standard of living dropped by 20%, later falling to 30%. Prices rose 80% just in the month of January. Families were spending 60% of their income on food, 20% more than before. 100,000 car owners forfeited their vehicles because they couldn't afford the costs. The prices of gas and electricity jumped 400%, which also ended the taxi business. Farmers now had to drive into cities like Warsaw to sell their produce. However, there were no protests or riots as a result of these rising prices like there were in 56 and 70, 76 and 88. While there were no protests, Solidarity's vast party membership dropped from 10 million to 1 million. In 1989, just before the neoliberal takeover, the private sector, except agriculture and co-ops, employed only 13% of the workforce, which would rise to 34% by 1992. When adding agriculture and co-ops to the private sector, the number is 60%. However, this organization of the economy couldn't even produce 50% of the previous GDP, a powerful demonstration of how inefficient the private sector is versus the previous socialized public sector, even as deficient as it was in Poland. With all this hardship, aid poured in from NGOs and governments who bought into the cult of privatization, and of course the US was the most active in imposing their initiatives for a reborn capitalism in Poland. Not much progress was made, and by 1996 they were still focused on 4 areas of development: private sector, financial sector, local government reform, and brainwashing Polish trade unions into supporting free market capitalism. For such a supposedly superior system, these are pathetic results, honestly. It wasn't just Polish trade unions that had to be convinced about capitalism. They had to win hearts and minds, which Western organizations and governments were all too happy to help with in order to mold Poland's emerging capitalist system in their own image. Oh, and banning communist parties through vague and ridiculous constitutional clauses against class hatred and totalitarian methods, amongst other nonsense. From these examples, it should be clear that the so-called Iron Curtain didn't so much fall as it was torn down, just as it was put up by the US and their foreign policy interests. Each and every time that socialism in a country fell to neoliberal ghouls, the quality of life for citizens plummeted off a cliff while prices soared and jobs became scarce, or at least less secure, and I've made a video on that here. State assets were sold off, usually for pennies on the dollar, to foreign capitalists, ensuring that not even native capitalists benefited as much. The biggest winner in all of these revolutions weren't the people, the bureaucrats, or even the leaders of the coups. It was the United States, its allies, and the owners of capital they all serve. Socialist Poland was a messy effort, and no leftist considers it a good example of socialism, though we understand why it had the issues it did. It was in fact the opposite, a clear list detailing what shouldn't be done. That doesn't change the fact that a future millions fought for was stripped, so that a depopulated Poland could be a source of cheap construction labor, exploited nature, and sex trafficking. All under the hands of successive neoliberal and regressive right-wing governments, mind you. The Polish people deserve better. A relevant book recommendation on the topic is Class Struggle in Socialist Poland with Comparisons to Yugoslavia by Albert Szymanski, which you can find PDFs of online. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to
Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.